Kenya will start taxing cryptocurrency exchanges for commissions they receive from the over 4 million people dealing in digital currencies in the country if fresh regulations are adopted. The new regulations guiding the payment of the digital service tax require platforms that facilitate the buying and selling of cryptocurrencies and other digital assets to pay a 1.5% duty. The value-added tax, which comprises electronic, internet and digital marketplace supply, Regulations 2023, published by Treasury Cabinet Secretary Njuguna Ndongo, states that for the purposes of these regulations, a taxable electronic, internet or digital marketplace supply include facilitation of online payment for exchange or transfer of digital assets, including services exempted under the Act. Now, a digital asset is anything that is created and stored digitally and has or provides a value. Now, in January 2021, Kenya implemented the 1.5% digital tax, service tax, which officials say has already helped curb tax avoidance by some multinational companies. The question is it apt or premature? And will that in any way improve the value of the crypto world as much as it intends to improve the fiscal portfolio of the country? And also, will these crypto platforms comply with this new directive that will be coming on board? And from London, United Kingdom, I'm being joined by Dr. Iwasalami, and she's going to be talking to us about this. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm looking at Kenya's crypto ecosystem. Would you say that it is robust and structured enough to support Kenya's fiscal needs? And talking about its value and worth, how would you describe it in terms of looking at the fact that we have about 4 million Kenyans as customers who actually operate on this platform and trade with this platform?
Okay, so obviously the Kenyan crypto asset market is quite huge. And actually, on the basis of Chainalysis reports, I think of 2021, actually rated as one of the largest on the African continent. So the size of the Kenyan market is actually quite big. And as you say, actually, the total market capitalization actually for transactions as at 2021, obviously we've had the bear market since then, actually it's to the tune of 6.48 billion Kenyan shillings. So that's a quite large size. And, as I say, is the second largest after Nigeria on the African continent. So it's quite big, yeah.
So with these crypto platforms that in some climes are said to be in limbo because they do not have physical presence, most especially in Kenya as we're talking about it, but then they operate in other countries, but then have a virtual presence in Kenya. Do you think this particular move by the Kenyan government to tax these crypto platforms, do you think it will work? And if it will work, how do you think it will pan out? Would it be a drastic process, or you think it will be a gradual evolution?
Okay, so obviously one of the areas or how easy it is to actually tax obviously firms, whether they're crypto asset firms or not, is that we get them signed up, we get them registered. So they're registered. Once they're registered, it's easy to track who is who. But of course, we know that from the way that crypto asset exchanges and the virtual and crypto asset service providers have worked, is that quite a number of them are able to go under the radar without being registered. And of course, if they're not registered, i.e. if they're not centralized virtual asset service providers, then it's very difficult to actually find out what they're doing. And you're quite right in sort of saying that there has been a difficulty there, not just only in Kenya, but across the world. And therefore, taxing the system is much more efficient when we place that responsibility actually on the users, which would be basically the citizens that are transacting. That is not to say that there aren't any challenges with that as well. But once we find, or once the exchanges are placed under the obligation to actually know who is transacting on them, i.e. fulfilling this KYC, know your customer requirement, then it's easier to track the individuals that are transacting beyond a certain amount, for example, or depending, of course, on what the tax regime is for taxing individuals. That then becomes easier to achieve than trying to actually track different types of transactions happening by firms a huge number of which aren't actually registered on the system.
So does that mean that in terms of getting revenue from crypto exchanges, does it mean that the deduction will be from the consumers, from the customers, from the users, as it were, who transact on these platforms, or is it going to be directly from the profit of these cryptocurrency platforms? I'd like to understand that, because you talked about KYC. So if the Kenyan government is going to be approaching these platforms to see how it can generate revenue from it, would it be from what the users get in terms of return on investments, or is going to be from the profits that these platforms actually have, whether they declare it or not?
So if the platforms are registered, right, then it'll be easier to chase them to get that, them to actually pay up tax in that respect. But we know that a lot of the transactions happen, by virtue of individuals or maybe a group of people that are transacting, but aren't transacting as any form of registered platform or organization, which then makes it very difficult, like I said earlier, to track them. So, so there are two things. The exchanges, if they're registered for tax purposes, can be liable under the tax regime. You could also hold liable for tax people that transact on the exchanges. And obviously, it would be easier for registered exchanges, because they're registered, to have fulfilled a KYC requirement for their clients, which basically means that they would have to know all those transacting through them would have to fulfill a KYC requirement. But then you need the exchanges registered first. And part of the registration process requires that they fulfill the KYC obligations. So for those that are not registered, they can carry on sort of obviously getting away with different sorts of transactions. What we would need now would be potentially blockchain analytic firms such as Chainalysis to actually want to help governments catch or find out those particular persons or individuals or groups that are actually transacting without actually having been registered. And there are actually blockchain analytical tools that can be adopted for those.
All right. So finally, before we end this particular conversation and move to the next, you've talked about registration of these crypto platforms, and we know that for a while now, the digital currency ecosystem has been volatile and it has been unstable, and some have even collapsed, and some people have lost investments, as it were. So now that the Kenyan government is hoping to tax and get revenue from these platforms, does it in any way mean that people's investments will be protected? Because it's not just enough for you to want to tax these people 1.5% in terms of levy being paid, with not you as a government offering some sort of buffer or protection for these users?
So that's a very good question. And to be honest, it isn't the tax laws that would protect the investors. So it's very interesting, the approach that the Kenyan government is sort of taking to regulate crypto assets exchanges across the world. There's been this issue that cryptocurrency exchanges aren't actually properly regulated. So, and predominantly, a lot of that is around the lack of, specific targets at this crypto exchanges. So, for example, issues like, regulating against, violations to transparency, issues around sort of market fairness, operational resilience. These are very unclear, fragmented, and as we say in most cases on the African continent, particularly for exchanges, they're non-existent. And so, for example, with respect to transparency, some exchanges lack corporate financial products or legal transparency, or at the very basic level, offer no information about how they protect either crypto or fiat holdings. And the lack of information does not help to create trust and confidence either, in these exchanges. So, and if it doesn't create trust and confidence, it then means, of course, investors aren't protected. And this also links with market fairness, links with, and in the way that the crypto exchanges work. So in terms of sort of market fairness, for example, there's a need for credible information about, how crypto exchanges transact, and transact using their own funds. in what in finance is known as proprietary trading.
Okay.
So there needs to be regulation around all of that. You know, there needs to be regulations around how, if we don't sort of regulate how they're transacting with their own funds, there's a likelihood that there could be a conflict of interest with using, for example, customer funds to transact.
Okay.
And we saw the problems of this manifest in, for example, the FTX collapse.
Okay.
And so that's important. And just one last thing, actually, operational resilience. There's a huge need for regulation around those areas in terms of sort of protecting consumers.
All right.
So that, for example, there's hardly any business continuity disaster recovery plan for most exchanges. And these have to come, these have to be, if we really want to protect investors, these have to actually be in place. So the protection really is not going to be gotten from levying taxes against the exchanges, but that we need to deal with how the exchanges themselves are transacting. And a lot of these things I've highlighted, we saw play out in the table way in FTX.
All right, Doctor, let's quickly talk about the issue of Bitcoin, because we know that it's a leading digital currency, and we see that it is already rebounding and increasing from about 30,000 US dollars to about 50,000 US dollars. That is actually the prediction, but by next year it will increase to about $50,000 in terms of its portfolio. And that was made necessary by what is called a process called halving. So I'd like to know or understand what halving means and how it is actually adding value to the digital currency.
Okay, so the Bitcoin halving process really is really to the effect that, after a certain period of time, okay, the network would mine, say, 210,000 blocks. And each blocks is basically about, the various transactions that the network, mines. And roughly every 4 years, the block reward given to Bitcoin miners for processing these transactions is cut into half. And that's where this whole process has derived its name, sort of Bitcoin halving. And that's because it cuts the rate at which new Bitcoins are released into circulation. So basically the impact of this then means that it's a deflationary framework is actually built into Bitcoin. And because the amount in circulation is reduced, what that then means is that potentially that would boost the value of the currency in itself. And over time, we actually see that has been the case.
All right, so finally, before I let you go, is this particular mechanism a new step being used to address the challenges that you mentioned, or it is something that has been there over time but then has not been as effective as it should be now that it's been effective? And finally, we know that crypto markets have crashed over time. Are we likely to see the trend where halving becomes a tool by which crypto platforms use to stabilize the transaction and the activities of crypto transactions, as it were, on their various platforms? Just about a minute, please.
So this whole Bitcoin halving is built or has been built from the scratch into the Bitcoin network and its operation. So the first halving, for example, occurred in November 28, 2012, where the amount of Bitcoin that miners actually receive dropped from 50 Bitcoins to 25. The second happened in the 9th of July 2016, where it was further reduced from 25 to 12.5. And the last one we saw happened in May 2020, where it was further reduced to 6.25 Bitcoin. The next one is anticipated to happen in 2024, which will further reduce or halve the amount miners earn to 3.125. And this process will continue until I think 2140, which is when the last of those Bitcoins would be mined.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ewa, for joining us. Really appreciate your expose right here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.